Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. Today's video is going to be different because we're not actually painting a miniature. We're going to be making 3 custom bases instead. For the few years that I've been painting miniatures, I've been avoiding making complicated bases. What you can see in front of you is the small amount of basing materials that I own, and my goal is to try and make something cool with what I've got. They probably aren't going to be masterpieces because I just haven't made that many bases compared to how many miniatures I've painted. So I'm just at the beginning of my basing journey, and so this video might be good for you if you are in the same position and you don't know what to do when making bases, or if you're just looking for a bit of inspiration on some cool ideas for bases that you could make. I learned so much from this video as well, so I'm going to share loads of tips and tricks so you can avoid doing all the foolish things that I did. So what you'll see me doing first is marking out with a pen on a blank base just a structure for a set of small land masses. I have 3 basing ideas in my head, but I'm not going to reveal what they are just yet because I want to leave you in suspense. But this first small 60mm base is going to have these little rocky outcrops on it. That's all I'll reveal for now. So I'm marking those out on a cork sheet, and then I get to cutting out those pieces of cork once I've marked out the shapes that I want. As I cut the pieces out, I arranged them on the side to try and organise how I was going to put them onto the base. And I made sure to use the cork structure I'd drawn earlier as a guide to also help me remember where everything had to go. Once I had everything lined up, I checked that it was okay with my template from the cork that I'd drawn earlier, and then I started to trim all the pieces to make sure that there was nothing overhanging and that all the gaps I'd drawn were going to be accessible with a brush and tools later on. After that, I glued all the pieces to the base with super glue. And then one final pass of trimming and cutting the pieces to get exactly the desired shape that I wanted. Then I started to play around with some slate rocks that I was going to put on top of the pieces of ground. In the end, I didn't use the big one in the middle, but I did use a bunch of small ones around the edges like this. Then I cracked open a brand new pot of texture paste from AK Interactive. I don't own that many texture pastes, and of the ones I do own, I've really only ever used 2 Vallejo texture pastes like I did in my previous videos. Once I had covered all of the raised areas of the model in this paste, and some of the sides as well, I had something that looked like this. And I wonder if you can tell what I'm going to do, but I'm still going to leave it as a mystery for now. What we're going to do is jump onto the next base now, and start working on the second one, which is a completely different thing. It's a slightly bigger base. We're now using an 80mm base instead of a 60mm base. And this time I've marked, as best as I possibly can, 3 lines to create 6 segments on this base. I'm then using some cork sheet again, and this time I'm breaking little triangles off of the cork sheet in order to stick them around the edges of the base, as you can see there. And then we're going to use milliput, and the idea of using the milliput was to roll out a long sausage and then use that sausage around the edge of the base that I can then place all the cork on so that it lifts all the cork up at an angle. As I wanted this to feel like the middle was lower and the edges are raising up as they've been damaged or broken or something like that. Where I marked the 6 lines, I also made sure I cut out some of the ring that I'd put around in milliput so that I had gaps for later on. Then it was time to add my cork, just dry fitting it for now without glue, just to see how it will look and plan things out. Once I was happy, I could then add the glue and stick them down. And then I spent a bit of time with my knife and with some sculpting tools just cleaning up all of the milliput and making sure it didn't look like I just added random sausages. So I cut away any excess and I smoothed some of the edges and pieces so that it all looked more like the ground rather than pieces of milliput on a base. And at this point, this is how the base was looking. So I then did a little bit of refinement, just made sure that none of the cork pieces were overlapping with where I had my 6 lines, as that would be important for later. I then rolled up another piece of milliput and I started adding semicircles to the end of where my 6 lines were on the base. This would give me a small crater-like shape at the end of each of these lines, which is what I was trying to aim for while I was doing this. And I was just using basic sculpting tools to try and push and move the milliput into the shape that I wanted. When I had completed all 6 of the little craters, it looked like this. Then I stuck a circular piece of grey board to the middle of the base, and this was to help me in the future for when I stick a miniature on the base, I'll have a flat area in the middle where I know I can stick something. And then I added my texture paste to the whole base. For this time I used a different texture paste. I used Astro Granite. It's one that I've never used before, it's just been sitting in its pot for years. In the Astro Granite, I used one of my tools with a sharp edge to mark the 6 lines. I knew where they were because they were formed equally in the distance of the gaps between all the various pieces of cork, so I could just take my tool and roughly scrape a line through the texture paste as it was drying in order to really figure out where that would go. I had to add a little bit more texture paste to raise the edges so I could have small mounds on either side. That would just give it a little bit more 3D-ness. And then I threw some different size rocks all over the base in different places, mainly in front of the pieces of cork to help create more of a gradual transition upwards, rather than just having the flat side of the cork on its own. And then for the final step of this second base, I covered everything in Astro Granite. That includes all of the milliput around the edge and the tips of the cork, even though I don't show it here in this clip. Everything had to get covered in Astro Granite because otherwise all the textures of the cork and everything might still show through. Then it was time to move on to the third base of this video, and this is the biggest base so far. This one's 90mm in diameter, and I used this special tool to find the middle, and then I drew 2 main lines in the middle to get the exact center point. And then from the center point, I used markings with a ruler just to find and draw a small square that was perfectly centered. Once I had that, I marked it in card and cut that out, and then I marked a big circle the size of the base in card and cut that out as well. I checked to make sure that the circle was the same size as the base, that I'd done it correctly, and then after that I cut out a few more circles of the same size. Then I needed to cut out 3 cork circles of the same size as the base as well. These would help me create volume and make the base taller. And once I had all those components, I dry fitted them all onto the base just to make sure that they were all the right size. Then I glued down the first layer of cork. By gluing the cork onto the base, I had hidden where my center lines were, so I needed to find them again, which meant I had to cut into the middle of the circle and try and identify where the lines I'd drawn were so I could leave a square that looked like this. I'll be the first to admit that working with cork was not ideal for this, and the edges of the square are a little bit messy. But anyway, I worked on what I was going to put in the middle of that square now. And I've got my square of card, and I cut out the center of that so that I could add this cool plastic grate from the Void Bases box from Warhammer 40k. Knowing that that will fit in the middle, I decided to glue on the second layer of cork and did the exact same thing. Had a square in the middle that I cut first this time before I glued it down. At this stage, I knew that it would be difficult to reach this square in the future, so I decided to cover everything in black primer now. So at first I used a Vallejo black primer just to lay down a layer that paint would grip to, and then I used a pure black paint from Chimera just to make sure everything was really dark and that we'd have no light spots showing through in any awkward places later on. I wasn't happy with my initial discs, so I prepared another disc, and then from the middle of this disc I cut out the square that was the same size as my other smaller square. My idea was to cover the top layer of cork with this card so that it was smoother and didn't look as corky textured. I then grabbed a second smaller inner square and I cut out 2 strips where they have these teeth, these interlocking metal teeth. And with all these bits prepared, I decided to dry fit my plan so far, which should start to give you a bit of a hint as to what this base will end up like. When I was happy, it was time to prime and prepare the undersides of all the parts I'd be gluing in the middle, and then to stick them into place. Also, I would say overall that I definitely recommend trying to use plasticard in all the places where I used grey card if you try and ever make something like this. I cut tiny little strips of cork in order to create spaces for the different layers that I was going to have here. And these pieces needed to be thin enough that they'd be hidden by the thin strips with teeth that I cut earlier. Once again, to check that I was happy, I started dry fitting everything without glue, and then when I was happy, I started to paint some of the undersides black once again, before it becomes too difficult to reach those areas. And then when I was sure it would look okay, I glued the second layer into place. And with the top then glued on, this is the main structure of my base. So hopefully, this looks like it's a small lift or hatch or something opening as this platform rises up or goes down in the floor. But the edges of the base were still cork, and I needed to make sure that they didn't look horrible and all unneat, so I glued a strip of grey board all the way around the edge and then filled any gaps in that edge to make sure it was all smooth. Or at least as smooth as I could get it. I didn't plan to leave the top of the base blank, so I played around with small pieces that I had in my box, just bits left over from other kits and little greeblies and stuff, and I just planned to lay those out in an interesting way on the top. I liked the idea of covering the lift on 3 sides with slightly raised platforms. That would help denote which side you walk up to the lift from, the sort of access side, which I'm pointing to there. That's where you walk onto the lift, and then you'd press the button at the end of the lift. And in the end, this is what I came up with. This was a pretty simple design, and in the future, if I was doing this again, I'd definitely stack up way more bits and make it more interesting and probably a bit taller. But here we go. These are the 3 bases, now with their structures all laid out, so it's time to prime them. And so I primed them all in black, and here they are, ready to paint. I have to mention that before I get to the base at the bottom there, I did do a test of this transparent water material that I was using. I had to make sure it worked, and I would always recommend doing a test. Because it's transparent, I wanted to see if it would taking like a paint added to it, and it did, and it worked out quite well. So I knew that what I was going to do following up on this base soon would work. I used heavy black green, which is an extra opaque colour from Vallejo, to do the edges just around the pools, and then in the pools themselves I used rainforest from the Army Painter. For the rocks I used AK's grey-green paint, which I just covered in all of the rock parts and the sides of the rocks as well. So by this point you can probably tell that this is going to be some kind of crazy acid pool or sludge pool or slime pool base, and I think initially I was going to go for a really neon green, which is why I went for this rainforest colour, which is really bright and vivid. But in the end, you'll see things didn't quite turn out that way. Next up was to dry brush all of the mud areas, so I kept adding increasing amounts of grey and rainforest green to the grey-green base coat in order to make it brighter and still keep it slightly green. Then I just dry brushed each of these increasingly bright colours on sequentially until eventually I had a really bright highlight. To create a little bit of difference, I just added Agrax Earthshade to the rocks just to give them a slight brown tone. To create my slime or acid pools, I used Vallejo's transparent water effects, and you can see I'm scooping out just a large amount of that to add to the lid, which I'm then going to mix with fluorescent green paint from AK. Once I'd mixed up the mixture and got a nice green colour, I knew from my test that this was going to work, so I then applied it to the base. The only thing I didn't know at this point was what it was going to look like over the green base coat, because foolishly, on my base, I hadn't painted it beforehand, so I just did the effect over the black base, which meant you could see the black base through the transparent effect. But because of this transparency, I thought that the green showing through from the paint underneath would give a cooler effect. I used one of my tools to just spread it out evenly, and then I had something that looked like this, and I had to wait 24 hours overnight for this to dry and set. While we wait for that though, I moved on to the next base. To paint this base, I used charcoal from Vallejo Game Color, and I covered the whole thing. And then I dry brushed on my highlights using Sombre Grey. Sombre Grey is also in Vallejo's Game Color range, and I used it in a 1-to-1 mix with charcoal for the first dry brush, and then I used Sombre Grey on its own for the second dry brush. I think I actually did a third dry brush with Wolf Grey, which is a much brighter blue grey, and I just added that into Sombre Grey rather than using it purely on its own. After dry brushing, I used the violet paint from Chimera's range, and I painted this into all the lines that I scraped with my tool into the Astrogranite earlier. I then used heavy violet, which is an extra opaque Vallejo paint, as my first highlight in the middle of those lines. I now used the same paint to draw some circles in the middle. Next up was Alien Purple from Vallejo, and I used this as a much brighter colour to paint just in the middle of the lines, trying to leave a little bit of the previous paints visible on either side. For my brightest purple highlight, I used a Lustful Purple from Vallejo Game Color, and I painted that even thinner down the middle with a smaller brush. I used that paint as well to paint some circles in the middle and a symbol in the middle as well. I went for a diamond shape that looks a bit like an eye in the end. Around those lines, I also added a bit of the previous layers just to blend them in. And then you'll see here I jumped forward a little bit, but basically what I did was I just added a bit of white to the middle and I really circled some of those lines just in the center. And then I'm just adding a dot of white to the end of all those 6 points. Then I decided to freehand some runes into this. And if you hadn't guessed already, this is meant to be some kind of magic circle or ritual circle that some kind of sorcerer is using in the middle of a destroyed area. I did think about adding some city rubble elements or something like that, but I didn't want to add a time period to this because I don't know what miniature I'm going to put on it yet. And in the future, if I decide to put a fantasy miniature on it, it can be fantasy. If I wanted to put a sci-fi miniature on it, it could be an urban futuristic cityscape. So maybe I can add more to it in the future when I know the miniature that I'm actually going to add to it. What you've seen me just do is add a violet ink from Vallejo all over the purple areas just to try and unify the colors. But that does mean I'll have to come in with and re-add the brightest purples and the whites again. I added that ink to the rocks as well, just the areas closest to the circle in order to create a gentle OSL effect. And then as I mentioned, this is me re-adding some white back to the middle. And finally for this base, I gave the edges closest to the magic circle in the middle, around the rocks on the edges, a highlight of the colours I'd used, which was alien purple and lustful purple, just to bring them into the environment more, and only added the brightest highlights to the very closest areas. So next up, we paint the third and final base. For this base, I also used charcoal from Vallejo to lay down a base coat on the lower areas surrounding the hatch. I then used deep grey from Army Painter to paint the raised levels around the lift. And then I used Sahara Yellow from AK to paint the opening door hatch bits. The side of the base closest to us is meant to be the walk area where you walk up to the lift. And so I wanted it to have these like panels on the floor, so I tried to paint them in with freehand, and I'll change that later on. Next up, I painted a yellow area on the edge of the walkway just in front of the lift. I imagined that if you were walking up to the lift, there'd be a warning of where you're stepping off of the area of walkway onto the lift itself, so I got that prepared with yellow as well. Then I painted everything that was metal with Vallejo's gunmetal grey from their metal colour range. That paint applies really nicely and smoothly and is a really good consistency. After I had painted all of the metal parts, I moved on to shading them with Agrax Earthshade. And I could have used Nuln Oil for this, but I chose Agrax Earthshade because I thought the introduction of some brown would create some contrast and make everything look dirty or rusty. Then I decided to do some edge highlighting, so I took all of the different areas and I edge highlighted. For the deep grey areas, I used the other Army Painter paints in the grey set, which I think are Uniform Grey and Ash Grey. And then when I highlighted the lower charcoal areas, I just mixed charcoal with Stonewall Grey from Vallejo in order to get increasingly brighter highlights that I just edge highlighted with. Eventually going all the way up to pure Stonewall Grey, as it's quite a bit brighter than the charcoal. After the highlighting was done on those parts, I painted some black lines on my yellow areas. This was to create hazard lines, as these areas are where there's either a step to walk onto the lift or they're moving doors that could accidentally crush someone or, get in your way or something. I just freehanded these lines. I didn't use a ruler or any measuring-y stuff to try and make them super neat. I figured they would look okay once they were painted if I kept the lines fairly straight. Next up, to really sell this, I had to use a lot of brown paint for rust. So I started with a dry rust effects paint from Vallejo as my first layer, and then I used my typical go-to Mournfang brown and Scrag brown for my rust. I made a change here where I turned the two panels I'd drawn on this walkway area into one. I just thought that made it look more seamless, more like it was a proper walkway area that was one path. And then I continued to add the rust until I was happy with it, which included adding some to the walkway area as well. It was looking a bit clean on its own. So then I wanted to paint the lights, so I started with a white paint, and then I covered all of the white areas with a red ink. I thought red lights for warning, for, you know, gloomy spaceship. I thought that would be pretty cool, so that's what I did. I don't have an airbrush yet, so at this point I just had to brush on a slight OSL, and I didn't want to go too crazy with this, so I just kept it small around all the lights. But with an airbrush I could have done some really cool lighting around this, I think. I could have done it with a brush, but I don't really know how. I will be definitely doing some videos where I learn how to do OSL in the future. Finally, on this base I painted in some silver highlights, and then it was done. At this point I went back to my acid pool base, and I noticed something really weird. The transparent effect had worked, but now there was this line that I could see visibly underneath it. And I thought, I can't have that. That doesn't look great. And so I thought, you know what? I'll take this opportunity. I'll repaint it all a lot darker. We'll make it into a darker, sludgy, slimy acid instead. And we'll go again. Hopefully we won't get that line in it next time. So after painting everything with a more intermediate green or dark green, I then added in my paste again and went for the same thing. I didn't add quite as much fluorescent paint. This time I added a bit of normal green paint as well. And when that was finished, I had something that looked like this. Now these are pretty cool. These aren't amazing bases, but this is my first time ever having a go at making some really designed and sculpted and made bases, something a bit different. And so for that, I think it's really important that I did this, that I tried it, and hopefully I can use some of the things I've made here to build on bases that I'm going to do for miniatures in future videos. I hope these bases have inspired you. I don't see a lot of bases like this, so I hope that they've been really cool ideas that you can use in your own hobby as well. As always, thanks so much for watching. Please support me below, all the usual things. If you like my content, it will really help me grow. And I'll get cracking on another video, so hopefully you'll join me for that one.